I presume all of you have this book. Yeah? Everyone have it? You've been enjoying reading it? Yes? Of course? Okay. Just a note about the fly sheet. The fly sheet has two parts on it. There's an outline, which runs for about the first page and a half. And then I have included in the rest of the fly sheet, that covers about 2 pages, all of the quotations from the text that I have used that are included either on the fly sheet in the outline or that are quoted on the screen or simply quoted by me as I speak. Okay? So all those quotations are actually in order in that second half of the fly sheet. This may be a way of kind of suggesting that what I'm doing is actually making an argument about the text, and I'm providing you with the evidence, hopefully, that supports my argument. If you don't feel that it does, that's certainly something you could bring up in your separate sections of the class. So, this week and next, you'll be reading and discussing the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Thucydides' history is important for understanding the ancient Greek world, but perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of CS, it provides insight into how we understand the world we live in, the human condition, and the standards we hold as ideals. And so it has a lot to say about our own existence and our world at the level of the individual and at the level of politics. In fact, all of the readings in CS do this to varying degrees. With Thucydides, I should point out at the outset, what we see is that the Greeks are starting to look at the world in a different way than, for example, Homer did. So as you're reading the text, kind of think about how his view is different from Homer's. So who was Thucydides? First of all, he was an Athenian who lived in the 5th century BC. His history of the Peloponnesian War recounts a war between two cities, Athens and Sparta, that occurred during his lifetime. On one level, the purpose of his history was to explain what happened. So people who want to know what really happened, who won, who lost, or people who want to be entertained, since that sometimes is another function of history, can get what they want from the book. But many historians examine the past to uncover something of the deeper reality, the forces and the circumstances that shape particular events. So the question is then, what is Thucydides telling us in this history? He states very boldly in the text, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." This is quite a claim. How can an account of a war that occurred 2,500 years ago possibly have any relevance for today, much less forever? Most of what we know about Thucydides comes from his book, and it's not much. He refers to himself in the first line. Thucydides, the Athenian, wrote the history of the war between Athens and Sparta. He lived in Athens in the 5th century BC, but he was not an ordinary Athenian. He tells us that during the war he served as a general in the Athenian army. He was only 35 years old at the time. He also mentions that when he was a general, he was ordered to defend the city of Amphipolis in Thrace in northern Greece. The city was valuable for its strategic location and for its wealth. Remember the gold mines I mentioned in northern Greece. But Thucydides' military expedition failed to arrive in time to defend the city against the Spartans. Consequently, the Athenian assembly punished him. He was dismissed from his command and sentenced to exile from Athens until the end of the war. Exile, of course, was a common punishment. Being evicted from the polis was a common punishment in ancient Greece. He took the opportunity of his forced retirement to research and write his history of the Peloponnesian War. So he traveled extensively to interview participants in the conflict, to visit the various theaters of the war in Greece, and perhaps as far away as Syracuse on the island of Sicily, where the outcome of the war was decided. He died in the year 400, however, before he could finish writing book 8 of his work, in the middle of his narrative of the year 411, with 6.5 years left of the history to recount. In order to understand his book, it's helpful to consider his intellectual background. Not much is known. In his history, he says he admires a man named Antiphon, who is a sophist and politician. Sophism, very briefly, was a prominent intellectual movement in 5th century Greece, known for the use of rhetoric in argumentation. So one of its proponents claimed, for example, that he could make the weaker argument the stronger. Thucydides, however, seems not to have been interested in the usual benefits of sophism, which Plato later associated with the political ambitions of well-to-do young men in Athens. However, some see the influence of sophism in Thucydides' rhetorical techniques. For example, in his presentation of antithetical elements, that is, opposing elements, the cities of Athens and Sparta, for example, or the politicians Cleon and Pericles. Why does he do this? What do these cities and men represent? That's something for you to think about as you're reading the text, something for you to think about while you're discussing this in your classes. He also reports two sides of political disputes, and he does this quite often. For example, in the debate at Sparta, the series of speeches at the outset of the war, and this is part of your assigned reading. In these speeches, you, as the reader, can examine directly the conflicting arguments and points of view. So perhaps Thucydides is telling us that this is how we should try to understand the world, by looking at opposing points of view. Thucydides used this technique of oppositions also in his narrative style. So, for example, in another part of your reading assignment, the funeral oration of Pericles, he writes about Pericles, who's a great Athenian statesman and an advocate of democracy, who in the text gives an eloquent speech on the virtues of Athens. This speech is full of noble ideals, and it stands in stark contrast to the absence of ideals and the reality of the plague epidemic that later ravaged the city and that follows the funeral oration in the text. In the funeral oration, Pericles declaims to the Athenians, "What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is and should fall in love with her. When you realize her greatness, then reflect that what made her great was men who are ashamed to fall below a certain standard." The standard of Athens is based on the lawfulness of Athenians. And so Pericles continues, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break." He seems to be telling us here that our behavior, our action in society, should be guided by laws. But written laws are not enough. There are unwritten laws too. Perhaps the expectations of personal virtue and moral behavior that we need to follow also. Then Thucydides, because he's opposing these two scenes, the oration plus then the plague, he goes on to talking about the plague epidemic that devastated Athens. Those unwritten laws appear to be little more than an illusion. In Thucydides' eyewitness account of the plague, he says, "In other respects also, Athens owed to the plague the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws. So doubtful was it whether we would survive to enjoy the name of it. It was generally agreed that what was both honorable and valuable was the pleasure of the moment and everything that might conceivably contribute to that pleasure. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence." So, why does he contrast these two, the greatness of Athenian law and virtue in the oration and the appearance of lawlessness with the plague? Was he attacking Pericles? Was he attacking Athenian virtue, or simply being cynical? Think about this. Thucydides' understanding of both Pericles and the plague demonstrates his ability to see these deeper realities that I referred to before. For example, the tensions underlying civic virtue, the fragility of the standards of human character. Whatever his background, Thucydides had a remarkable ability to observe the connections between the individual and the world the Greeks lived in. The author of the History of the Peloponnesian War was an Athenian who served as a general in the Athenian army, who was removed from command for failure in that war and punished, who wrote a history of that war that he fought in. In other words, you might expect him to write a grossly biased history, one that favors one side over the other. As you're reading the text, does he have a bias? That's something else to kind of consider. Moreover, he claims that this history will be of relevance for all time. So if his method of history might be matched, his confidence would certainly be hard to beat. So, is Thucydides' confidence an act born of hubris? That may be a word that's come up in the last couple weeks in your classes. For Thucydides, history meant a systematic inquiry into contemporary events. So you can think of the title as not the history, but rather the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War. He had little patience for the interest his predecessors like Herodotus showed in the romantic element of the stories they recorded. His criticism of Herodotus and others is indirect, but it is certainly clear that he considered the historical method used by them to be entirely inadequate. He quietly remarks, "The rest of the Hellenes too make many incorrect assumptions not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. Most people, in fact, will not take trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear." This is something, of course, that we can apply to our own lives. Think about the things you hear, chatting with friends, the things you're inclined to accept as true. Is accuracy really have anything to do, however, with friendship or familiarity? Thucydides concerned himself only with contemporary events, and his approach to doing history rested on the conviction that little can be known of the distant past. However, I would argue that his historical method, his principles, his ability to distinguish what's significant from what's not, proves for us today that much can be learned from any past, no matter how distant. So, what was his historical method? First of all, he avoided discussion of the myths and gods, the supernatural. This had no place in the analysis of human affairs. And so here's a very important difference with some of the readings you've had before. Politics and society were subjects to be examined with skepticism. He states that all evidence should be tested for accuracy. He says, "And with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war," this is on the fly sheet, "I have made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own personal impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard of them from eyewitnesses, whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible." He says that the accuracy of his evidence was further enhanced by his development of a chronological scheme in which to incorporate his data. The lack of a standard calendar in ancient Greece compelled Thucydides to devise his own calendar. So he developed this system in which he measured time from the first year of the war, and each year is divided into summer and winter seasons. So he has this array of verified information which he can place in a particular context, and this allowed for the effective interpretation of his evidence. Primary causes could then be distinguished from secondary causes. Political and military events take on sometimes a superficial quality, as if they were symptoms of problems. And some people have likened his approach to a doctor looking at symptoms of a disease. These symptoms reflect a deeper reality. Much is made of Thucydides' method, but remember that his method was also tempered by his particular view. When Thucydides refers to reasonable accuracy, that's a quote, or truest causes, another expression he uses, we're reminded that we are reading his interpretation of the war just as we read his interpretation of the speeches that he reports to us in such detail. He says, "I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches, which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speeches say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation." Think about that. The historian Herodotus recreated the atmosphere of the past. Herodotus is the historian that Thucydides criticized. For Thucydides, recreating the past was not enough. His historical method forms a narrative that contains arguments or interpretations, founded on the belief that our knowledge of the past is useful because we can understand it from all sides. An expression he uses, from all sides. We can see the difference between the profound and the superficial that way. So, his intellectual acuity may have been sharpened by his sophistic training, that is, figuring out how to make good arguments, but by our reading between the lines, we get the sense that his historical method was also guided by moral convictions that perhaps ran as deep as those realities he was trying to bring to the surface. By means of understanding history, Thucydides believed we could make better political judgments. And aren't political judgments really moral judgments? And at least understand, if not entirely avoid, such tragedies as the war between Athens and Sparta. So, what does the book consist of? It consists of arguments. This is my argument. When we look at the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War, that is, to use a variant title, as an account of the past that includes interpretations and convictions, it becomes clear that the book contains a number of these arguments. So, for example, we might consider it a treatise on historiography, which is the method of doing history. After all, he argues that his evidence is more reliable than, he says, that evidence of the poets, like Homer, who exaggerate the importance of their themes, or of the prose chroniclers, like Herodotus, his historical predecessor, who are less interested in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, whose authorities cannot be checked. This method formed the foundation for additional arguments. So, for example, what I would call a historical argument. In the past, the Persian War had been considered the greatest war. This was actually an argument made by Herodotus. But Thucydides argued that the war between Athens and Sparta was the greatest war of all time, as he expresses it, more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. His reasons for this claim: it lasted such a long time, 27 years. He says, "Never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never had there been so many exiles, never such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. The destruction wrought by humanity was followed by upheaval in the natural world. Wide areas, for instance, were affected by violent earthquakes, eclipses, drought, famine, plague. All these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes after the outbreak of the Great War." So historical argument, historical argument, and then what I might call an interpretive or political argument. At another level, he argues that the power and greatness of Athens was a result of its development of navigation and commerce. The Athenian navy enabled the city to accumulate wealth, and this was the foundation of its empire. On the more immediate causes of the war, Thucydides reported the complaints of the two sides against each other and the clash of their respective interests, that is, those of the Athenians and those of the Spartans and their allies. But those superficial causes obscured the real cause of the war, according to him: imperial ambition. Thucydides argues that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. And we could go on and say that his argument, his kind of series of arguments has an even wider reach, okay? As with many thinkers of his era, the broad scope of his vision rested on his conviction that moral issues and conflicts were an integral element in politics. Thus, the history of the Peloponnesian War is not strictly a story of the conflict of Athens and Sparta. The story runs deeper. It's a story of moral conflict experienced by human character, or the story of the strengths and weaknesses of individuals and societies to understand forces that are usually difficult to comprehend entirely, or to comprehend from all sides, to use his expression. Just as Athenian democracy failed to comprehend the implications of imperial ambition. This wider understanding underlies his entire effort. It will be enough for me, he says, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past, and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. The principles of his method and his vision of Hellenic history enable a deeper understanding of human affairs. According to Thucydides, human nature being what it is, you might talk about what that means, okay? Makes such an understanding absolutely imperative, I would say, but also implicitly, human nature also makes understanding possible. So, this is a complicated book. And it's important to try to kind of peel away, this is what I'm trying to do, peel away some of the layers that allow you to kind of get your heads around it. You're only reading a fraction of it, remember, and the quotations that I put on that fly sheet are only a fraction of the fraction. If his main thesis deals with the history of imperial ambition, and his approach to history is founded on moral convictions, how do these elements relate to each other? One way to answer this question is to start by untangling the various strands of the conflict. So, at the time of the Peloponnesian War, Greece was not unified. It consisted of city-states and villages, their inhabitants speaking various dialects of Greek, all sharing a common heritage and religion and poetry. Okay, so they all worship the same gods, they all read Homer, just like you guys. These various small states shared a distinct sense, however, that they were Greek and different from everyone else, whose essential characteristic, at least from the Greek point of view, was that they were simply foreigners, or barbarians. This is where the word barbarian comes from. In spite of this common identity, however, Thucydides informs us that there existed a variety of differences between the Greek city-states. In particular, there were fundamental differences in culture and economics and politics that separated Athens and Sparta. And for this, you can see the part of the outline on the fly sheet under elements, where I've kind of created a little table there. In spite of this common identity, so there are these differences. The inhabitants of Athens and Sparta spoke two different dialects of Greek. The Athenians were Ionians, whose customs and traditions were different from those of the Spartans, who were Dorians. Although such differences are often superficial, the cultural divide between the Spartans and the Athenians ran even deeper. Just as Sparta was landlocked in the middle of the Peloponnesus, the peninsula at the very bottom of the Hellenic peninsula, it also isolated itself from cultural change. The Spartan educational system helped them field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenic world, and it also helped them resist the new intellectual attitudes, like those of the sophists, and the approaches of people like Plato, who you'll be reading also, sweeping over 5th century Greece. Athens, on the other hand, was receptive to all sorts of innovation and was open to Greece's intellectual and artistic revolution. The speeches at the debate at Sparta suggest to us that the gulf was so deep between them that conflict was practically inevitable. The speech of the Corinthians expands on these differences. An Athenian, according to the Corinthian, who lives in between the two, is always an innovator, quick to form a resolution and quick at carrying it out. You Spartans, on the other hand, are good at keeping things as they are. You never originate an idea, and your action tends to stop short of its aim. So on the one hand, you have people who are too quick, and on the other hand, you have people who are too cautious. And again, think about the oppositions that I referred to before, the antithetical elements. The war between Athens and Sparta was as much a conflict of cultures as it was a war of politics. So you can compare the two maps here. One kind of shows political alliances, the other is with these kind of cultural areas. Another major difference between Athens and Sparta concerned their economic circumstances. The Spartans in the middle of the Peloponnesian Peninsula were self-sufficient in food. Consequently, the city was rich in natural resources but poor in money. Athens, in contrast, had too little farmland to support its population, and it relied extensively on seaborne commerce to supply its needs in food and timber. Aside from its mineral wealth, Athens was a thriving commercial center. So it had access to a steady income, and it was further enriched by money collected from the members of the alliance it led. So it has maritime commerce, okay, that's bringing in this wealth, this money. It was this wealth that allowed Athens to build the Parthenon and other monumental buildings that the city is so well known for. We often take these buildings as symbols of Athenian democracy, but we might well take them as symbols of Athenian empire. Those buildings cost a lot. The political constitutions of these two states were radically different as well. Sparta possessed a form of government very stable that combined elements of monarchy and aristocracy. Sparta's agricultural domain was worked by a conquered people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and who were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any signs of weakness. To prevent this from happening, the Spartans relied on their stable government, their rigid educational system, to build a powerful land-based military that could control these people who worked for them. In contrast to the Spartan form of government, the Athenians, after more than a century of political upheaval, had established a democracy. The citizens of Athens, a category, of course, that did not include women and slaves, could participate in the public affairs of Athens. In the view of Thucydides, who was not a proponent, by the way, of radical democracy, the proper functioning of Athenian democracy depended on the quality of its leading citizens. This is where virtue and character enter the picture. For example, he says of Pericles, whom I've mentioned before, because of his position, intelligence, and his known integrity, Pericles could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. So in what was nominally a democracy, power was really in the hands of the first citizen. But the collective citizenry could vote, and thus the city's policy could quickly change to suit their wishes. Because an effective speaker could easily sway the assembly, men who lacked virtue used their influence to manipulate the citizens of Athens. For Thucydides, Cleon was perhaps the most notorious of these demagogues, one who would exploit popular prejudices or passions for his own political gain, for the violence of his character, as Thucydides says, for the violence of his character, and his influence over the citizens of Athens. It was the powerful influence of demagogues like Cleon that made the political life of a democracy like Athens, even though it only, principally is based on this minority of free individuals. But it would nevertheless make that political life so precarious. Thucydides' opposition of these men like Pericles and Cleon, men of virtuous character on the one hand, and men without virtuous character on the other, gives us a hint that he was arguing that goodness or virtue may have been the real victim of the war. The various cultural, economic, and political features of these two city-states shaped their respective imperial policies. While Sparta oppressed a subject population at home, the various states within its Peloponnesian League could act with considerable independence. Okay? The League's political and military decisions tended to be slow, expressed in the opinion of the Corinthians in the debate at Sparta, which I referred to. Athens, in contrast, as head of the Delian League, was ruthless and characteristically quick to lord it over its so-called allies, to the extent that Athenian democracy counted for nothing beyond its walls. So you can think about, kind of comparisons with the modern world and imperial political projects and the kind of rhetoric they espouse. Athenian imperial ambition grew out of its powerful political position at the end of the preceding war with Persia. This is, of course, the war that Herodotus considered the greatest war. The growth of Athenian power, Thucydides argued, endangered Sparta's political security. The gradual realization of Athenian imperial ambitions upset the balance of power between the two cities. The pressures built to such a degree that diplomatic maneuvering against weaker neutral states triggered the armed conflict between the two powers. Thucydides showed that in an imperial world, the political neutrality of cities such as Melos, described in the Melian dialogue, another part of your assignment, could be as flimsy as Athenian democracy and was simply a prelude to their destruction. So you can kind of think about if you're not for us, you're against us. There's no possibility of straddling the fence in this type of politics. In this respect, Thucydides was realistic, I think, in his depiction, but his recognition of this should not obscure his ideals from us. So, how can we penetrate all this? Okay, we're talking about a pretty complicated book. I've noted on the fly sheet the three phases of the war. Now, you can't possibly really understand all the historical details of a conflict like this, especially when you have a history which admittedly does not cover the entire thing. But this may help you kind of understand a little bit about how the events followed. So there's three phases of the war. It lasts for 27 years, okay? And I think really a more effective way of understanding this is to understand themes, okay? So in this last section, we can start to look at particular themes, major ideas that he talks about. Empire, ambition. This is what I mean by themes. Justice, noble purpose. Virtue, human character, okay? Understanding, how we understand the world. We know that this is a story of a war between Athens and Sparta, but what was at the center of the conflict, okay? Maybe all these themes allow us to understand that. Thucydides mourns the general deterioration the general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world, what he calls the simple way of looking at things. Okay? What does he mean by this, the simple way of looking at things? Perhaps that political ambition can distort the way we see things, or distort the way people are, and lead to moral collapse. Maybe. Let's look at, okay, so within 3 years of the start of the conflict, I should point out that Athens' allies rebelled. Okay, they're being kind of restrained by this imperial power that is really trying to centralize decision-making. And so Mytilene rebels soon after the war starts. This was a matter of grave concern to the Athenians, since the Mytileneans had a large fleet, too invaluable to the Athenians to lose. The issue of how to resolve the Mytilenean problem was debated by the Athenians. Okay, this is in a section, again in your reading, called the Mytilenean debate. Some Athenians, led by Cleon, felt compelled to make an example of Mytilene by killing all of its male citizens and enslaving its women and children, a common enough practice, actually, in ancient Greece. Cleon argued, punish them as they deserve and make an example of them to your other allies, plainly showing that revolt will be punished by death. The central issue of the debate, however, is not whether to spare the Mytileneans, okay, these poor people who were almost innocent bystanders, but what is best for Athens? Pericles had foreshadowed the moral blindness that would afflict Athens when he said, your Athenian empire is like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it, but it is certainly dangerous to let it go. And in the debate, Cleon the demagogue echoes him, the man of virtue, all right? The man of lack of virtue echoing the man of virtue. He echoes him, if the Mytileneans were justified in revolting, then you Athenians must be wrong in holding power. The point here, the virtuous ruler and the demagogue sound frightfully similar in this imperial context. The moral foundation of noble character is destroyed by the political demands of empire. The moral collapse of Athenian politics foreshadowed the moral collapse of Greek society, first observed in the civil war in Corcyra. Fathers killed their sons, men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. The bonds of family were desecrated, as were all the other elements of social life, even language. To fit in with, to quote him, to fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. The ability, this is important, the ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Perhaps Thucydides is referring to himself back in Amphipolis in that context. After the death of Pericles, 2.5 years after the start of the war, the state of Athens deteriorated even more. Thucydides relates that Pericles' successors lacked his foresight and character, adopting methods of demagogy, which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. Not only did they lose control over political affairs, but they ultimately lost the basis of their empire. Private ambition and private profit led to policies which were bad for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. With the loss of character, it is too easy to adopt the principle that might makes right, as at Melos and at Syracuse. And as you can see from the quotes on the fly sheet, at the end of the war, when the tables were turned. At the end, the Athenians were on the verge of being enslaved themselves. Athens failed to understand the situation from all sides. So, what are we to learn from Thucydides' history? What lessons might it teach us? So that, in his words, his work would last forever, particularly in civilization studies. The history of the Peloponnesian War has as many lessons as it has arguments. But clearly, Thucydides' history, built on the solid foundation of his method, his convictions about character, and shaped by his vision of history, has more to teach us than the story of the dissolution of an empire. Thucydides speaks of standards of character. While Athens and Sparta were the chief opponents in the Peloponnesian War, in many respects, I would say, the protagonists of this history are Athens and Thucydides himself. Pericles' funeral oration praised Athens as a lesson for Greece. The irony of this phrase and the larger context of Thucydides' story is revealing. Athens was a lesson for us, but not only in an admirable way. Consider what lesson Athens almost taught at Mytilene and did teach at Melos, and what her army demonstrated outside Syracuse. Don't follow the example of Athens. Human nature, being what it is, and the fragile role of the noble character in human affairs, makes the lesson of political ambition one that will be relevant forever. As for Thucydides, with his ability to understand a question from all sides and his sharp eye for pretense, which could distinguish the profound from the shallow, he penetrated the surface of his era's moral system, exposing the fragility of human goodness. Athens lost the war, and political ambition claimed a lot of victims. But perhaps the real victim was noble character, the simple way of looking at things. Time and again in the history, he shows us that justice is honored more in speech than in action, and more by the weak than by the powerful. But that doesn't make it right. By following his standards of thoughtful judgment and character, perhaps we too can sharpen our own vision of humanity and achieve something in the study and practice of virtue. So keep studying and practicing. It's very important. Have a good day.